Back with the Ready State, we have another case study today. And this is a pretty common example. We see a version of this come across our emails at least once or twice a week. And it goes something along the lines of, I've had some shoulder pain, I got some imaging, and it came back with a small labral tear in my shoulder. Surgeon isn't recommending surgery at this time, and what are my next steps? So I want to just kind of start with our shoulder structure here. We're looking at a right shoulder here. You can see this is kind of the acromion. We're looking from the back view. If we kind of look in at the side, the labrum is a cartilage structure that's kind of underneath the capsule here. And what the labrum does is it creates some depth. So it tries to kind of, instead of just having just a flat socket that's a little more what the shoulder blade is, that kind of creates a more deepened socket. It's still the head of the humerus is much larger than the shoulder joint itself, but that labrum plays a really big role in stability because it creates more of a rim that adds a lot of stability to what the bones are, and the joint capsule is not crazy stiff in the shoulder, and the shoulder itself has a lot of freedom of movement, but it sacrifices stability for this. So that labrum plays a really important role in stability in the shoulder. What do you think, Di? When you hear that case, like as a coach, what are you thinking there?
So when it comes to, and we have plenty of athletes that I've worked with where, they've had something in their athletic or fitness journey that has impacted the shoulder. And if I use myself as an example, I when I was a young person, taught myself how to snowboard. And there were many times where I've, caught the head of the board and then basically, Tom and Jerry style, like shot myself shoulder first into the ground, and then I'd have an immobile shoulder for about 3 to 5 days until I saw somebody who was manually able to kind of free up my shoulder so I could restore range of motion again. Mm-hmm. So just using myself, when I have that level of instability, one of the things that I start to think about is like, does it impact my range of motion? And then what do I need to do congruent inside my training program to kind of restore that strength and stability?
Absolutely. I'm similar. I had, maybe 10, 12 years of competitive rugby, lifelong surfer, and have been throwing barbells around for a good 10, 15 years. I don't want to see the inside of my shoulder. As a physical therapist, when someone starts with, well, I got the MRI and it came back with X, Y, Z, a bunch of stuff, I think it's important to remember if you get a picture of the inside of your shoulder, the person who's taking that picture, their job is to list everything that they see. And, this is where we have to kind of get into, well, what's clinically relevant, and what is actually causing that pain. So if you have a list of 4 or 5 significant pathologies that can be listed or measured on a picture like an MRI, does that mean every single one of those rises to the level of this is actually impacting the shoulder? And sometimes it does. Sometimes that's the case. But, you were saying, like, if we took a picture of either of our shoulders, the likelihood that you would come back with positive findings on an MRI is close to 100%. Right. That doesn't mean that I can't raise my arm over my head. That does not mean that I can't go surfing tomorrow. That doesn't mean we can't, have a snatch off, except I wouldn't do that because I'd lose. But the point there is the structure is related to the function, but the structure doesn't 100% determine the function. And if you learn, like I was saying, that labrum is a component of the stability. And if you compromise to a small degree the labrum, you've taken away a little bit of what we think of as kind of the passive or innate stability system. So, when you take someone with a very healthy shoulder and just say, hold this overhead, they might not do it the most skillful way possible, but they can generally do it. If you take someone with a labral tear, you have to be much more specific about how you do that because that person has to generate their stability more dynamically. They have to use their muscular stabilizers more effectively, basically.
Right. So the setup sequence has to be much more intentional.
Yes.
And what is this intention that you would take your athletes through to be able to create that level of stability in the structure?
It's all the same cues that we're always using. And we're thinking rotationally here primarily because the rotator cuff is the primary stabilizer of the shoulder. If we look at our shoulder here, right, those muscles come around, and when we kind of jam our shoulder back into place in here. But when the shoulder muscles come around, they kind of create that cuff. They're there to kind of create stability and squeeze that shoulder in. And that helps to keep that centered so the ball is moving here and it doesn't start banging around all around that labrum. So when you have this kind of motion, that's really bad for a shoulder because the labrum is there to resist that. But if it can just kind of go around the dotted line there, now you have a potential for some instability in that shoulder as it relates to that labral tear. So we're thinking break the bar, screw into the ground, kind of turn the elbow pits forward, all these classic shoulder stabilization cues that you would teach to anybody. They just become much, much more important in the setup because that person may not passively be able to stabilize that shoulder, and then there's an instability right in the middle of that system.
And so one thing that I found when it comes to, maybe slight labrum tears or anything that has to do with the shoulder is, do you recommend limiting the range in something, say like a push-up or like a bench press?
So I have a criteria for this because maybe, yes, no, it kind of depends on the athlete and what they're able to do. So one of the things I should say about a labral tear is most commonly we tear kind of from the top to the front, which creates a likelihood of more of an anterior instability. It's not that's the only place that a labrum can tear. It is the most common place for a labrum to tear. So as we're going into the press, the most common mistake that we see or compromised archetype is that we start to shift or tilt forward, which puts a lot of pressure to the front of that joint. So if you already have an instability at the bottom of that press archetype, if you hit the end of your extension and then continue to kind of sneak a little extra in by tilting forward, you're pushing forward into the weak spot in that system.
Right, and the athlete typically will experience some type of like pain or extreme soreness there.
Right, and we also have, and this is really critical, I think this is an important thing to know about shoulders, is the apprehension test, which is I won't go there because I think I'm going to dislocate. Right. That is something you should absolutely respect, but that's by itself a positive labrum instability type sign that if you're like, nope, not going anywhere near that, that's your brain saying like, you're getting close to the cliff, don't fall off the edge. Right. And so, what we want to do is, yes, we want to teach the athlete their best stability, and then, we might limit that range of motion to the degree that they can control. Long term, I'd like to see that progress up to a reasonable degree of that complete motion, or hopefully they are able to get that complete archetype shape back, depending on exactly where their tear is and how afraid of that they are. Maybe we don't go into full extension, but we can modify that, put a 10 or a 25 pound plate under the chest for push-ups, or do floor pressing instead of bench pressing so that you kind of artificially constrain the end ranges of that. So that's one way that I'll work around that while still getting the pressing mechanic, because it's critical.
And what style of stability exercises would you do with the athlete? Would you pepper in like rotator cuff exercises? Mm-hmm. Would you pepper in isometrics like plank holds or handstands?
Totally. One of the things that we see a lot from classic rehab is you see a lot of isolation, single joint, and a lot of times it's short lever. You grab a band and you're doing rotation outward, rotation inwards. Maybe you're doing this in some different planes, but it's still a single joint moving through maybe 1/4 of the joint range of motion to 1/2 of the joint range of motion. It's very slow. These are the kinds of isolation accessory movements that, I call this like a snack. right? It can be, if it teaches you how to control a movement, then there's a good value to that. But there's no like 1 repetition max short lever band external rotation championship of the world.
I've been doing it wrong.
You've been training for the wrong sport, Di, is what I'm saying. So, what we're thinking there is, these types of rehab exercises are very, very useful. And that's where this kind of fits into our model of tempo and isometrics as the root of rehab, because it allows you to explore at a very slow speed. You kind of get to do the matrix walk through of your, more complex ranges of motion. And if you have a part of that range of motion that you aren't able to control, we do want to be able to isolate that down, play with the parameters of that, make it either easier or harder until you can have success with that. But then we don't want to miss that last piece where, you've taken this complex multi-joint whole, you take a single small individual part of that, an isolated part of the range of motion, an isolated piece of the whole movement, but then you have to put it back into the whole. And I think sometimes rehab hasn't done a great job of that last step where we show the athlete, okay, this rotation here and here and here, like that's also important for snatching because it's the same thing, but done faster.
So what I'm hearing you say is that I shouldn't make a snack a meal.
Right. Well, and this is where a lot of the kind of rehab or shoulder stiffness, shoulder stability programs, it's like, oh, well, you don't do push-ups and pull-ups and cleans and snatches anymore. You do, band exercises and isometric holds, and that's all of your shoulder work forever. And it's like, there's a time when you're in a fairly significant amount of pain where that's a reasonable thing to do. It's the most your shoulder can handle. And that degree of accuracy to protect yourself from pain might be very, very high. You need to be very, very careful with that. We're always working towards that full expression of movement. So even if it takes a long time to build back up to that, or even if we have to heavily modify, when someone comes off of, this athlete, for example, when they start to go back to pull-ups, maybe it's been 6 or 7 or 9 months since they've done a pull-up because they weren't able to reach their arm all the way up overhead and they weren't strong and stabilizing. So I'm not going to give them body weight pull-ups the first time. I might give them the 150-pound purple band, and they might have to slow themselves down or they will be shot up at the ceiling. Right. But they're still going to be responsible for control through that range of motion, and we really just tip the scales in their favor so they can do it very, very accurately. And then gradually we will build them back up to full speed or full resistance. But I want to also have the whole thing. I want to have complex multi-joint movements as part of this system. And maybe that's where we scale it a lot. We don't necessarily have the most resistance, or it might even be assisted. But we want to make sure we're not putting this person on an island where they only get to move their shoulder like a robot, one body part at a time. And it's like, I don't know, there's a place for that, but it still has to fit back into the whole.
Right. I appreciate that inside out approach to integration.
Yeah. Just thinking about the shoulder, shoulders are a vulnerable joint. They're the most commonly injured joint in athletic populations. And, almost anyone who's been in the game for long enough probably has a shoulder injury of some degree. And, it's really about, is this preventing me from doing something? And then we want to just sort of walk that back and figure out, how do we work around that? How do we hold the shoulder and keep it into the positions where it's safe and happy and you're not going to continually just neg that problem until you do make it bad enough that it does need to have a surgery. If you respect those limits early, you can save yourself more problems later on down the road.
And the shoulder has the greatest range of motion in the body, correct?
Absolutely.
Right.
So you treat your shoulder right, it'll keep working for you for a long time. And if you don't, it won't.
Sean, I appreciate the education. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Di.